Socialism explained at 3 different levels of complexity. Talking to everyday people. Socialism is when the workers own the company that they work for. It's at odds with capitalism, where one guy can own the whole company, tell everybody what to do, and take all the profits that they earn. We stopped running our countries where one king or queen could tell everybody else what to do and take all of the profits. So why do we still run our companies that way? Not everything needs to be a product for a company that's run for profit. Look at fire departments. That would be awful if there were several competing fire departments that wouldn't put your fire out unless you paid a subscription service and they could jack up their prices and make a monopoly of it. Or look at healthcare and education. You get a lot better outcomes for a lot less money for way more people if you run these things not for profit, owned by the public. Talking to people on the left. Socialism is all about private property, but private property doesn't mean your toothbrush or your iPhone. These are personal property, things you own to use personally. Private property are things you own just so that others can't use them without paying you a little bit of rent first. This includes things like owning a business you don't work for, just taking the profits out of it as the business owner, or owning housing you don't live in, just taking rent as the landlord. The owning class gets their income just from owning things. The working class gets their income for working for the owning class. Under capitalism, there's a cycle where the owning class gets so rich so fast that they can afford to keep hoarding more and more of the economy. Then they use their unlimited wealth to take control of the government and use it to get even more property. Socialism is about breaking that cycle, making more private property to be publicly owned or owned by the workers themselves. Talking to Marxists. Karl Marx theorized that socialism is when the working class takes control of the state and uses it to transfer private property to be publicly owned by the state while rapidly developing the productive forces to outpace the capitalist states. As more and more of the world's private property becomes publicly owned, what makes the owning class, their private property, diminishes along with their class itself. The owning class and the working class have dissolved into one team for humanity. Because the purpose of the state is for one class to suppress the other, there is no more purpose for the state at all. Your society and economy have developed beyond the need for a government. Welcome back to communism. And yes, I said back, humanity of course started under communism, where there was no property, there was no profits, there was no government, just people doing things collectively for the good of society. Every early human society around the world started with the basic communist economic model. With the advent of agriculture came a feudalist economic model. That land and that agriculture could be owned and managed by a decentralized state. People could take the profits and use it to hire people to protect their property. With industrialization and factories came capitalism, with even more things to own. With that increase in productivity and profits came the ability to have a more centralized state to protect the property rights of the capitalists. Karl Marx theorized that socialist revolutions would happen across capitalist Europe. Now that the workers are in close proximity in factories, they could organize together to overthrow the state. But the places where successful socialist revolutions actually happened were still semi-feudal or colonized, with a weak decentralized state that could be overthrown by the working class. These early socialist countries tried to skip over capitalist development straight to socialism, with everything being owned by the worker-controlled state. They were not adequately industrialized, and the United States would not allow them to trade with the rich capitalist colonial powers of the West. Because they started out so poor and weren't allowed to trade with the rich capitalists, they couldn't grow their economy fast enough to outpace the growth of the capitalist countries. Also because a lot of capitalist wars and genocides. That's why the socialist countries made deals with the United States to allow them to trade with the West and took a step back into a state-controlled form of capitalist development. Every socialist country that's been allowed to trade and get investments from the rich Western countries has had record-breaking economic growth. And now that the socialists have been able to focus on developing their productive forces in peace, you know, that second part of Karl Marx's theory, their share of the world's means of production is finally growing faster than the capitalists. Everything is made in China these days, and I don't understand why people call it capitalist when 60% of all assets in China are publicly owned by the Communist Party of China. And they have many sophisticated systems beyond ownership itself to keep the private sector in check. But they needed a private sector in order to welcome that foreign investment in technology so that they could accelerate the development of their productive forces fast enough to outpace the capitalists. Now, the Communist Party of China has a virtual monopoly that is state-owned on the entire world's rare earth mineral processing, and they're set to outpace the Western tech monopolies in AI, robotics, and automation. Agriculture brought us to feudalism, factories brought us to capitalism, and publicly owned automation will bring us to socialism if we can figure out what that word means in time.